right, so we left off beginning on this slide with much discussion last time. So, is Allah Jehovah? Some people that are Christians think that he is. Some people that are Christians try to compare God in the Old Testament to Allah, but we've seen that there's manifest differences between them. That's where we kind of ended last time. So, in Islam, God is a singular being. In other words, he's just an individual. So, that obviously is a huge contrast to Christianity. Now, even though the Old Testament does not develop the doctrine of the Trinity, it's certainly there. And the multiplicity within the Godhead is evident, grammatically as well as contextually and everything else. But it's the New Testament that actually really develops that. But the difference being that in Islam, God was alone until creation, so he didn't have his first relationship till he made somebody. Within Christianity, or in a biblical worldview, there was eternal fellowship, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So that's something, they didn't need to learn that. There was the love relationship that was already there. That's John chapter 1, verse 1, right? In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. The Word was with God. That means, effectively, the Logos was face-to-face in fellowship with God. There's an eternal relationship, and then what God does is he creates man and brings him into sharing what he already has. In Islam, it's a whole new thing for God. The first relationship was with man. That's his first experience, but obviously within the Trinity, man is brought into that relationship that already exists. So it's not like God has to alter or change in any way. In Islam, Allah is not a sacrificial God. He certainly did not send his son to pay for anybody's sins. Grace is not offered, and love is not the primary factor for Allah. It is submission. People need to submit to him. And within biblical Christianity, obviously, God is sacrificial by nature. He's giving, he's sacrificing, he loves, he's gracious. Obviously, he sends his son by grace to save us. So the source of our redemption, the motivation is love. The effect was then grace. God acted, and then all we need to do really is respond. Salvation is based, there is faith, but you are evaluated based on your works. In Islam and in Christianity, it's based on faith, but it's entirely of grace. In other words, though God wants me to have my own faith in response to what he did, there's nothing I can offer him. Faith is not a work. Sometimes people get confused. They think that if we exercise faith, is that some form of a work? Paul contrasts works and faith in both Romans and Galatians. So the issue with Christianity and Islam, everything based in the nature of God, the characteristics of God and everything else, it's not just that they are different, they're incompatible. So we're back to the law of non-contradiction. You can't have two things that are opposite and true at the same time in the same sense. So they cannot be the same God. It's just, you have to either change Islam or you have to change the Bible. It's one or the other. You can't have it both ways. So all views of God cannot be true. Now we know that, right? To claim all views are true is pluralism. Everybody gets to God their own way, basically. And it would violate the law of non-contradiction. It would violate correspondence with the facts, because that's how we know what's true. It would deny the absolute nature of truth, because you'd have all these contradictions that would not make any sense. You can't have God be everything and then separate from everything at the same time. You can't have both of them be true. To do this, in other words, to try to smash all this together and have it work, you would have to use the law of non-contradiction to try and violate it. In other words, if I was a pantheist and I said, no, I believe everything is God, and I'm God, right? So in order to try to argue my point, I have to actually use the law of non-contradiction, which my inherent position violates. Because here's the point with all, dealing with this from a theistic view. Anytime anybody argues a point or takes a position, they are exercising the law of non-contradiction. In other words, they're saying that your point is not equal to mine. That's why they have debates, right? So if I'm in disagreement with somebody, it's because I'm saying what you're saying is not equal to what I'm saying. I don't agree with you. We live like that all the time. That's how we naturally think. So we can't then throw that away and say, well, when it comes to God, that God just violates everything known to our understanding or reason, and then start eliminating it, because then what I'm actually saying at that point is, okay, so I'm going to use my logic and reason to argue that I should not use my logic and reason and understanding, so then I don't even know what I mean anymore. In other words, I'm not even communicating. I'm all confused. And this is part of the problem. This is, a lot of the nonsense that's out there, unfortunately. I would also have to use correspondence with facts to try to deny it. In other words, if I try to just make all religions, somehow true, I have some aspects that they're just not corresponding to the facts anymore. And the absolute truth, to claim a relative truth, is what I would be using. In other words, I would be saying, no, all views are correct, right? Even though what I'm claiming is a relativistic, I'm using an absolute truth to say that a relativistic truth is true. In other words, all these things are self-contradictory. And here's the illustration, right? Not all Scott Mitchells are the same person. Actually, in the 90s, there was a guy named Scott Mitchell. He was the quarterback for the Detroit Lions. And he was a Mormon, but probably still is a Mormon, actually. He's from Utah. So obviously, that is not me. I mean, our paychecks were obviously much different and everything else. But, my address and his address are altogether different. So you can call us the same because we have the same name, but we're not the same person. We never will be, right? So believing that he is me won't alter the facts. People can believe all they want that I'm him or he's me, and that doesn't change what the facts are. And claiming that things are the same that don't correspond to the facts doesn't make them that way. So it doesn't matter what I say, what I claim, what I believe. You need evidence. Evidence is the foundational bottom line to why we will believe what we believe. If we cannot have evidence for our belief, then we're on shaky ground. It doesn't matter who we are. Everybody with me? So, can all religions be true? No. They teach opposites, and opposites obviously can't both be true. Can one religion be true? Well, yes, one can. If we use the law of non-contradiction to discover what view corresponds to reality, that's where we're going. Do other religions have some truth? Yes, they certainly can, right? But since the opposite of true is false, if one religion is true, then all opposing claims or beliefs in all other religions, they would have to be false. So you can go to another religion and say, well, obviously, every single thing they say is not necessarily false. I mean, that would be an absurdity to say that every single claim that they make, though it's certainly possible, but to say that every single claim a religion makes is false, well, that's not necessarily true at all, okay? But whatever claim they make that is opposite the true religion and what it claims would have to be false. It's non-contradiction. So we're dealing with the cosmological argument, right? The universe had a beginning. That's what we're talking about right now, because we're dealing with the theistic God, right? The second argument is the design argument, right? The teleological argument. In other words, life reveals design. So these are the three arguments for the existence of a theistic God, not the God of the Bible yet, but just the fact that only a theistic God can be the God that exists. Can't have a pluralistic God, finite gods, multiple gods, you know. So the moral argument, right? People have a sense of morality or the moral law. So these are the three arguments that we will go through, and we're actually building on the first one, the cosmological argument, okay? So the cosmological argument is very simple, right? The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. Everything doesn't have a cause. Everything that comes to be, or everything that has a beginning, has a cause. God did not have a beginning, so he did not have a cause. He is the original, uncaused, first cause. He caused everything else. He's eternal. Yes?
I'm not sure what you mean by cause, like, if you were to define.
You're not sure what I mean when I say cause?
Yeah.
So, the effect is the universe, the existence of time, space, and matter, right? Space is a physical property. Time is obviously a physical property. We're part of that, right? And then matter. So they all came into being at the same time. You know, this is Einstein's relativity theory, you know, how that works out. But cosmologists understand the details of that, and physicists, that time, space, and matter had to start at the same time, okay? So whatever created or caused the universe to come into being, time, space, and matter, that would be the original first cause, okay? So if I made a table, right, you'd say, well, what was the cause of the table? Well, the builder. The builder caused the table, right? He built the table, or he created the table out of existing materials, but he was the cause of the table. The results was the table. Yes?
I think a good word here might be reliance, a reliance on something for its existence would be its cause.
Well, God is not contingent. In other words, I don't know, are you saying the universe is reliant on God? Or God is reliant on the universe?
No, the universe is reliant on God for its existence. It didn't bring itself into existence.
Yes, and we'll go through the evidence for that, Russ. But as far as cause, Mary Jo, when we say God is the original first cause, or he's the cause of the universe, in other words, he caused it to be. That's, you know, I mean, we don't want to use the word created because we haven't established that yet. We're just dealing with cause and effect, okay? Something had to cause the universe to come to be because it had a beginning. So logically, everything that has a beginning has to have a cause, okay? Regardless of what it is, right? I mean, that's That's part of the scientific method is a search for causes. You know, scientists look for what caused this effect, right? Yes, Russ.
Just as when you hear a sound, you automatically have this sense of something caused that sound.
Right.
Sounds just don't occur, you know, so we look for the cause.
Yeah, if you hear something, you look for what the cause is. I mean, if you hear a siren, you're going to look in the direction of it.
Something we don't need to prove as such.
Well, you don't need, yes, well, and we'll get into it but we understand gravity because every time we drop something, it falls. We understand that that is an existing law. Nobody actually knows what gravity is, right? Well, how do they know that it exists? They can't see it, you can't touch it, or you can't, you know, I mean, I don't know, you guys old enough to remember the Stooges? You know, go mix me a batch of spotted paint. I don't know if you remember that one, but, you know, it's like you can't say, go get me a bucket of gravity, right? Where do you get it? You can't, right? But we know that it exists. How do we know it exists? We know it exists by its effects. We know God exists by his effects because we can't go touch him, right? And we can't really see him because he's not part of time, space, and matter. He's beyond that. But at this point, we're dealing with just the fact that there is a theistic God that caused the existence of everything else. There was nothing, and then he was the cause of it coming into being. Does that make sense?
So some people even say the Big Bang caused the universe. We say somebody has to actually cause that Big Bang.
Yes. Yeah. And we'll actually talk about the Big Bang. There are some Christians that believe the Big Bang is a valid theory of the beginning of the universe based on scientific measurements, and other people, other Christians that are scientists think that it really doesn't work the way that it's advertised. So, but that, you know, when we'll talk about it, but we won't conclude on it, and I'll tell you why when we get there. So, but this is the cosmological argument. Everything with a beginning had a beginner. It's the same thing as saying, you know, everything that started had a cause. Well, the cause is the beginner. Something that has a beginning, it has to have a beginner, right? So, are you all set? Okay. So, the teleological argument, really, which is the argument from design, every design has a designer. Very simple. Life had a design, therefore life has a designer. It's easy to see design, complex design, in living things. And then finally, the moral argument, every law has a lawgiver. Laws don't just arbitrarily exist. Laws carry with them an obligation, an oughtness to them. You ought to do this. Yes?
What is that word, teleological?
Teleological is just, it's the $50 word for design, basically. In other words, that everything has design. Teleos. But under the moral argument, when we get into that, it's a very interesting interchange with people when you start talking about morality because it's where they live. And it's interesting to try to watch people avoid the moral argument, you know, for God's existence. But every law has a lawgiver. Laws don't just, they don't just like end up making themselves or existing. There is a moral law. Everybody has a sense of morality, so therefore there's a moral lawgiver. These are the three arguments that we'll dive into to establish the existence of a theistic God. Okay? Yes?
It seems like this is kind of geared towards complete non-believers, like atheists arguing the fact of Christ. But what if you're mostly around here, you're going to encounter Catholics? So they know God exists, they believe in God, they believe
Well, yeah. Well, and again, this is geared mostly towards atheists, but though we may live in an area where there's, I guess, a lot of different Christian denominations, okay? And a lot of nominal Christians or Christians, you know, people that claim to be Christians, and they don't really go to church or do anything. They just have an association with a denomination. That's pretty common for New England. But we also live in an area where younger than us, okay, you're dealing with more than one generation of kids that have never seen the inside of a church and don't actually believe God exists, okay? So if you're dealing with peers that are older, you know, I mean, look, I'm 62, right? So people that are my peers, most of them, when I was a kid growing up, I had Jewish friends. I was a Catholic. You know, I had Protestant friends. Everybody went to church. Now, I'm not saying everybody was an actual believer or anything else, but my Jewish friends went to synagogue. Their parents made them go, and a lot of their parents went. My Protestant friends went to church. My Catholic friends went. Now, we had to go, but to not have people somehow religiously involved when I was a kid was highly unusual. Now it's the opposite. You almost can't find anybody that goes to church. So there's an enormous gap over the years, especially, you know, when you started to, you know, come into the kind of millennials and everything else, where a lot of these kids they're growing up in homes where God's never discussed. They have, you know, public school education. Evolution is the solution scientifically to everything, and, you know, God probably isn't there anyway. So most younger people you talk to, though they don't have an atheistic philosophy of position, they're atheistic, a lot of them. I mean, if you go into Boston, right around the universities and stuff, I mean, most of them are atheists, or they've latched onto some Eastern religion because it has some appeal to, you know, alternative medical benefits or something. But they don't actually even know what they're doing. They're just kind of latching on to these pieces, but they don't actually know what that is. They're just kind of practicing an aspect of it, you know. So, no, this is, you know, when we get into some other areas, maybe apologetically and talking about the New Testament, it may be more helpful in that way, sharing with people that are kind of nominal Christians or Christians that don't know anything about the Bible or God, though they think they do. But yeah, this is you know, this isn't a hammer. Apologetics is not like a hammer just looking for a nail, right? Apologetics is something that needs to be exercised based on whatever it is that's in the way of a person coming to Christ, so that we can clear it out of the way. Now, its main thrust is establishing that God exists, that truth exists, that God exists, and if God exists, miracles are possible, and if miracles are possible, then it's possible for that miracle-working God to reveal himself to people. How would he do that? And then now we start looking at the evidences of the Bible. The Bible supports that, and that's where we go with it. But, you know, that's kind of a nutshell version, fast forward to everything. But yes, we're just at kind of, this is dealing with atheists, okay? But we need to establish this, because even among nominal Christians, people, though they claim to be associated with a denomination, oftentimes believe an atheistic worldview. Look, they did a Barna poll some years back, and even among like Bible-believing Christians, the Barna poll showed that 91% of Bible-believing Christians that they polled had a secular worldview, like a non-biblical worldview. That's how they answered. So it may be unusual for us to hear things like that because we have a steady diet of going through the Bible and teaching expositionally and everything. But, outside of here, especially around New England, you're not always going to find denominational churches that do teach the Bible. And sometimes when they do, they're a little bit thin, So if the people are not getting a good diet of the Bible, then what ends up happening is they're spiritually anemic, and then they don't actually have the capability to know that they're not getting it because they're not being properly fed. When you're properly fed, and then you're learning the Bible and your discernment is growing and your understanding of the truth and everything else, then you have more of a working knowledge of the Bible, so that when you hear things, whether it's in a church or outside of a church, you can filter it through that understanding, and then you can decide, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound quite right, and then you throw it away, or yes, that's okay. But if you never get to that place, you end up like a baby Christian, and like all babies, what do babies do as soon as they see something? They eat it, or they try to, right? You're always pulling stuff out of their mouth. Well, baby Christians are like that too. As soon as they hear something, they just believe it. They believe everything they hear. A Christian said it. Somebody that said they were a Christian said it. It must be true. Because they're all excited and they want to learn stuff, and they're like sponges. But the problem is not everything they hear is true. And they get confused. But it's important to understand this form of thinking, because this is never going to hurt you in approaching any kind of problem, because as we approach this topic and reason our way through this is the same assumed thinking process and skill that God wants us to use even reading the Bible. Like, how would we even know that the Bible is the Word of God? How would we know that the Bible says what it says? We use the law of non-contradiction. We know we can't read the Bible. It can't mean everything. It has to mean something, and it has to mean, if it says something is true, that means something else is not true. In other words, the Bible tries to correct our understanding, and it tries to correct our thinking process. But the thinking process, though we're using a terminology, we call it the law of non-contradiction, or that is a self-evident law that, the discipline of logic put a phrase to, just to kind of identify it. But people use it all the time, People have a tendency to think, we'll get into this when we get into the moral argument, people think relativistically, the things are all relative, and, relative to the situation and relative to this and everything else. And so they try to live like that, but yet that only seems to happen when we deal with morality, because when we deal with anything else, the relativeness goes away, right? Remember, what's true for you is true for you, but not true for me, right? Well, is that true for everybody, right? So if a policeman stops you and says, you were going 80 miles an hour in a 50, well, that's true for you, but not for me. Try that. I bet he'll still give you a ticket, right? I mean, he's not going to say, oh, I didn't realize that was true for me, but not for you. Go to the bank. I'd like $100,000. You don't have $100,000. Well, that's true for you, but not for me, so I need that money. I mean, nobody lives like that. But then when it comes to God, when it comes to morality and things that we don't want to do or we don't want to believe, we just change it. We say, no, that's it's different for everybody, right? So we want to be able to learn how to think properly, because most people's thinking is broken when it comes to things like this. And if we can think logically and clearly, then we'll come to obvious conclusions. And then once we start applying that, we'll realize as you go through the Bible, I mean, when you go through Proverbs and it tells you, you know, there's twice, Proverbs, 14 and 16, there's a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is the way of death, right? So that means there's a right way and there's a wrong way. It has to be. I mean, you know, you can't say, well, you can just do what you want and it's not the way of death. That there is a way of death. There's a way that I can think is right, but it may not be right. Well, how do I determine if it's right? I need somebody that knows what's right to tell me what's right. Well, who knows what's right? Well, it's not my friend. It's not some guy on the internet. It's not my buddy at school. It's God. Because God is the source of all truth. He is the unmoved mover, right? He is the eternal being, you know, that we're going to argue for here in a second. And he is the one that has established everything. He made everything. He made us. He started the whole universe, right? So all the laws that we have discovered, because nobody makes a law, you know, a physical law, natural law, all the laws that we've discovered, you know, the law of gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces, right? The 4 major laws and everything else. Nobody invented those. They already existed. The universe was functioning with them. The universe, because it's goal-directed, nature is goal-directed, and the universe operates by these laws consistently, then we can analyze it and it makes mathematical sense. Why does it make mathematical sense? Why does math even work? Because God ordered it like that. Everything is ordered, but it's only ordered because you have an orderer, right? So once we begin to understand that, it's like, okay, so who's going to tell me the way to live that won't lead to death? Well, the one that owns life and death to begin with, right? I have to find that out from him. Well, how do I know? What he has said, that's where we're going, okay? So here's the logic for argument 1, cosmological argument. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the beginner could not be part of it. That would be pantheism, right? We know that. There has to be a beginner. The universe didn't make itself. That would be atheism. So these two are ruled out. Can't be multiple gods, polytheism, and finite gods. They can't answer the beginner question because they all have limitations. The beginner has to be infinite and the ultimate of perfection. God cannot improve, increase, or anything. He is, I guess, an easy way to understand it is he is fully maximized. He is eternal. He is, he's perfect in every way. You know, again, when we say, we read in, you know, 1 John 4, God is love, it doesn't mean that he just has more love than you do. He embodies what love is, you know. You know how, you know, we joke and say, well, that person's the poster child for this or that, right? Well, in a sense, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, God is the poster child for love. You want to understand what love is, you have to understand God and his nature. You have to understand what he did to define what love actually is. That's how we understand. We don't just make it up, you know. We go to God to, so the better we understand God, at this point, we're just saying this theistic being, the more we will understand that, right?
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, prove that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
They do a good job on that little animation, don't they? I get that off of William Lane Craig's site, Reasonable Faith. So the universe had a beginning. I mean, the cartoon kind of put it all together, what we're talking about. Now, there's 2 lines of evidence that tell us that this is true. First, there's philosophical evidence that the universe is not eternal, right? Time is not eternal. I mean, obviously, if time was eternal, today would never have arrived. We'll talk about that in a minute. Time is inseparable from matter. They connect together. They have to have a beginning. And then there's physical evidence. The universe is not eternal because space is a physical property. In other words, we have a tendency sometimes to think that it's just the planets that went into space, but space itself is physical, right? And then the second law of thermodynamics acts on matter, and that's the law of entropy, or basically the amount of usable energy is running down. So here's the philosophical evidence, or the evidence from our reasoning ability, right, that the universe had a beginning. So we have the present day today, right? And then there was yesterday, and then there was the day before, right? And then last week. So because we can go back in time, the universe can't be eternal. Otherwise, there would be really no time. Time would have run out. There'd be no time. There's no measurement for time in eternity, right? So if the past were infinite today, it could never have arrived. You guys get that? That's the philosophical evidence.
Do you think that the Andromeda Galaxy is another universe?
No.
Well, about 150 years ago, it was called another island universe.
Mm-hmm.
And as we talk about things like the Big Bang, and maybe things that might be before it or a cause of, then the whole question of what the universe means arises, and your presentation doesn't deal with that well. And there are physicists who give serious idea to the thought of these multiverses, as well as there's this marvelous thing called colliding membranes. And your presentation does not serve your listeners well to not acknowledge them. So if you want questions, are you familiar with the membrane idea that the membranes collide? This causes this repeating universe, which you don't like. You're going to say entropy is violated and so on, like you did in Knoxville. Are you familiar with the membrane colliding theory?
Yeah, hang on one second. I'm looking for something here. Hold on. Stand by for vectors, Victor. There's all sorts of different theories out here, as you know, Forrest.
And we should say hypothesis, because hypotheses are things that don't have evidence behind them yet.
Okay.
In fact, we're struggling to find ways to test them.
You can say anything you want, but there's a difference between a possibility and evidence for a possibility. Right? You can say that we were all created by green leprechauns, but that doesn't mean that that's a theory that has evidence behind it. What has happened over the past 50 or so years has been that the standard Big Bang cosmology has taken all sorts of attacks from all sorts of different directions, oscillating universes, membranes, all this kind of thing, and it has come through as still the standard model for good reason.
Do you understand that the Big Bang theory merely says that the universe went through a hot, dense phase about 13.8 billion years ago? It does not say that there was a creation event before that. That's one of the possibilities.
There's a lot of possibilities, but
a lot of
even
hypotheses.
I could go through quote after quote here from
I think we served my purpose. Your first bullet in that slide it said creation, teleology. I'm going to mangle that word. Help me with that word. Teleology. There we go.
Teleological.
And moral. That first bullet, we've now demonstrated you've made a strong claim than you want. You've made a claim stronger than you want. I'm ready to surrender.
Okay, let me just, before you go, Forrest, I just want to point something out. Let's say, I don't grant this, but let's just say that somehow there's a new cosmological theory that comes along that supplants the Big Bang, right? Because science, as you pointed out...
It doesn't supplant it. It will enlarge it, and the Big Bang will be a special case of, or
all right.
Let
me make my point, okay? Let's just say that cosmology is tentative, because science is tentative. This is not tentative here, what I'm about to show you. That shows that time had a beginning. This is a philosophical argument for the beginning of time. Here's today. There's yesterday. There's the day before yesterday. There's last week. Question: can this line be infinite into the past?
Yes.
How could it be infinite into the past and today have arrived?
It can be infinite if there is no beginning. What we do see is that we now live.
Please answer the question. How could today have gotten here if there's an infinite number of days before today?
I believe that we are struggling against inadequacy of the English language, which lets us construct nonsensical questions.
How is it a nonsensical question to say that there can't be an infinite number of days before today for today to have arrived?
I think maybe I can try and address that by saying, can you hand me a piece of this nothing that was before, and we can talk about its properties?
You're sounding like Lawrence Krauss now. No, nothing is non-being. Non-being, nothing.
Do you have a piece of it that we can examine its properties?
No, because nothing is not a piece of anything.
So you're making philosophical assumptions yourself.
Forrest, okay, you don't have an answer, I understand.
My answer was that we don't have evidence of a beginning. That was my answer.
This is evidence of a beginning right here, because for a couple reasons. You can't traverse an infinite number of days to get to today. Secondly, you can't be at the end of an infinite. right? Because an infinite is something that has no end. But here we are at the end of the infinite. Thirdly, you can't add anything to an infinite. But tomorrow we're going to add another day, and the day after that we'll add another day, and the day after that we'll add another day. So there can't be an infinite number of moments before today. By the way, this argument was brought forth by a Muslim philosopher about 800 years ago and has since yet to be answered.
You know, it's interesting. When you listen, you know, I play these for the kids too. When you listen to some of these questions that people bring up, you can hear them avoiding the issue. I mean, this guy started talking about, you know, the inability to communicate with human language. It's like, well, so is he communicating? So he's not communicating then. In other words, he's undermining his own position by saying that there's no way to fully communicate his position. So then what's his position? In other words, once we start seeing these things for what they are and people avoiding the simple foundational realities of these conclusions, right, then, you know, you don't have to know everything to know whether somebody is saying something that's true. Because you just have to apply the claim that they're making against itself. You know, he's talking about things that don't have any, first of all, any evidence for them. They're just things that people dream up. Like the multiverse is that the idea that there's multiple universes and that we, you know, we're in this universe, but if we were in a different universe, we would be, you know, in a different situation within that universe. Maybe I wouldn't be, you know, losing my hair and, you know, overweight in another universe, whatever. So the problem is there's no evidence for it. It's just something that somebody is dreaming up. It's a fantasy. You still have to argue from what we do have and understand as evidence. Evidence is key, and it's going to be key when we get into looking at the New Testament too. So if the universe had a beginning, it has to have a beginner. There's no way around that, and that's why atheists try to avoid the beginning, and they try to make the universe either eternal or everything else. And by the way, if there's multiple universes, you're not fixing the problem. You're just pushing the problem off, because now you have to find a beginner for all those universes, right? So the evidence leaves us with the following two options when we're dealing with either the universe was created by somebody or nobody. Number one, no one created something out of nothing. That's the atheistic view. Number two, someone created something out of nothing. It has to be either or, law of non-contradiction. It can't be both. It's either or, right? Which is more reasonable. You know, it's interesting. When I was in grade school, I was in second or third grade, and that's when they still actually had prayer in school. They removed it right around then, but the question was asked because they started really emphasizing evolution. And, you know, like I said, growing up, and me, my friends, everybody went to church, so everybody had this idea of God. And so they figured, well, God created everything. So we're told, right? So, but being in public school, I remember the question was asked, you know, is evolution true? Some kid asked, is evolution true, or did God create everything? Right? Some kid was smart enough to pick up on that. And then the teacher's response was, if you're religious, you believe that God created everything, but if you're scientific, you believe in evolution. Now, to be honest with you, as a little kid, I didn't want to ask any questions because I figured, well, I must be way off the mark here. I don't, you know, I'm confused because to me at that time, though I didn't figure it out till many years later, until I got saved. But all through public school, that bothered me, because it would always come back. It's like, it has to be one or the other. It can't be both. Like, it can't be just like, if some kid says, well, I want to be religious, well, then that means God created everything. Well, I want to be scientific, well, that means we evolved. It's like, that's not possible. It's not possible that both can be true. So I was exercising, as a little kid, the law of non-contradiction in my own mind, though at the time, you know, I certainly didn't know that. All I knew was that somehow this doesn't make any sense to me. But I was afraid to ask a question, because it was very controversial because of the change and prayer being taken out of schools and everything else. So, you know, in answer to your question, so imagine entering school never being told anything other than you evolved from the common ancestors to some ape, and then where's God? I mean, God doesn't need to exist in that scenario, you know. So this was actually the guy that Turek was referring to, this guy Lawrence Krauss, who's a professor at Arizona University, or University of Arizona. He believes the universe came from nothing. Now, this book he wrote, A Universe from Nothing, it did make it to the number 11 on the New York Times bestsellers list, but with what we just learned, the simplicity of that, that's not possible. You can't have a universe from nothing. Nothing cannot make itself. Now, Lawrence Krauss's nothing is actually quantum fluctuations. In other words, you know, when you get smaller than the atom side, you're dealing with quantum physics and everything. So, but, you know, he's saying, well, that energy is what kind of made it happen and everything. And said, well, wait a minute, that's something. You know, quantum physics it's still something. It's not nothing. You know, like Aristotle said, nothing is what rocks dream about. That's nothing, right? But that's something. You know, you get some kind of quantum energy. That's not nothing, right? So maybe we need to be clearer on the definition of nothing. So here's him speaking. So you'll kind of get an idea of where he's coming from.
And there's a whole galaxy, it's about 1 billion light years away. We're looking at it as it looked 1 billion years ago. So many of those stars no longer exist. And here's an object that's just as bright as the whole center of the galaxy. You'd think it's a star that's near in our galaxy that just got caught in the picture frame. It's not. It's a star on the edge of that galaxy that has exploded. And exploding stars shine with a brightness of 10 billion stars. They're the brightest fireworks in the universe, supernovae. And they're remarkable, and I keep having asides. Maybe I'll get to my point eventually. But this is something that I wrote a whole book about, and someone asked me yesterday why I wrote that book. Because it is the most poetic thing I know about the universe. Richard wrote a great book called, what's it called? Our Ancestors? What's it called? Ancestor's Tale, yes. I wanted to make sure I got that right. And I wrote a book that was a different ancestor's tale. It was called Adam. But the amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They're created in the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way they can get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway.
It's always nice to know the kids are being really well educated, right? So we dealt with the philosophical evidence time, right? This is the physical evidence. The second law of thermodynamics is basically the universe, the amount of usable energy within the universe is running down, okay? So it's like gas in a car. Eventually you got to pull into another gas station, right? So the idea with the hourglass is that the sand is eventually going to all go to the bottom, right? So secular scientists, now these are people that are not Christians, they agree on a beginning. And this is what's important here. So there are secular scientists today who hold to the Big Bang as a viable scientific beginning of the universe. However, not all do. Now, not everybody does, right? Some scientists keep trying to say the universe is eternal, or they have a pipe dream for something else. But most of the really well-known and established scientists that are secular scientists believe the Big Bang. As Christians, we need to understand something. We're dealing with apologetics. We're dealing with making an argument for the existence of a theistic God. We're not talking about Jesus yet. We didn't get there. So the issue in discussing the universe at this point is not how it began, but that it began. That's really important, because when you're talking to an atheist, to start talking about creation and God created, and on the first day he created light, and start going through the creation days, it's going to be meaningless to them. They don't believe that. You have to clear their atheism out of the way by establishing that there has to be a being that caused the universe to come into being, right? So we're not jumping to the Bible yet. We have to first of all establish that there is a God, a theistic God, one that created everything and is separate from it, that exists. This is apologetics, not creation science. We're not talking about creation science here. So let's consider what the Big Bang is for a minute, all right? So this is Fred Hoyle, right? He was a British mathematician, right, astronomer. He's the one that actually coined the phrase Big Bang, and he did it as a mockery of the concept. He rejected the concept also, and also rejected Darwinian evolution. So he's not a Christian or a biblical creationist or anything like that, but through evidence believed that the fine-tuning of the universe required a designer. So he said this: a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. So that's the term Big Bang came from Sir Fred Hoyle.
In the beginning, there was nothing. A vacuum, void, empty space. And in this empty space, there emerged a primordial fireball. Billions of years ago, this fireball exploded. This explosion generated all space, energy, matter. The universe expanded rapidly, producing electrons, neutrinos, photons, and quarks. Soon, this energy began interacting, forming protons and neutrons. Matter continued colliding and interacting. Over time, the first simple elements formed. These elements also collided as the primordial soup continued to expand. Cosmic and particulate evolution continued, and stars began to group, forming into the earliest galaxies. And then, just 5 billion years ago, something wondrous occurred. Within a cloud of gas in a spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy, our sun formed. This new star gave birth to planets, moons, and asteroids. One of these planets, known as Earth, developed an atmosphere. Earth's environment believed to be filled with volcanic eruptions, lightning, turbulent weather, mixed atoms and energy to create the first simple living cells. Then, through millions of years of mutations and natural selection, algae, jellyfish, and flatworms appeared. As evolution continued, fish appeared in the seas on planet Earth. Some of these fish developed into amphibians, and through natural selection changed into reptiles. A segment of these reptiles evolved into a variety of creatures, including mammals. Some of these mammals became primates, and then, just 600,000 years ago, an isolated group of these primates evolved into man's earliest ancestors. This is our amazing evolutionary heritage. And evolution continues today as we evolve to our even higher destiny in the universe.
Bet you didn't know that's where you came from. So that is the secular view of the Big Bang. Christians that believe in the Big Bang believe that when God spoke everything into existence, that's kind of how it happened, and then the measurements that scientists measure today, that they believe are indications of that kind of explosion from nothing. I mean, obviously, the universe had to start from nothing. God had to speak it into existence anyways. So however that happened, when he spoke it into existence, we're going to just deal with the fact that that's fine. If they want to believe that the Big Bang is how it started, that's not our issue. Our issue is that it started, not how it started, okay? Because we're dealing with apologetics, not Christian science, creation science. But I want you to understand that's the secular view of the Big Bang, where basically stuff exploded into being, and then eventually through time and the mixing of matter together over time, you get you. Now that doesn't actually work, and there's no real evidence for that. However, that's evolution, and we'll make more of that next week. Let's pray. Father, we ask that you would just bless our time tonight, that you would give us understanding and help us to grow in our wisdom and knowledge. And we ask, Lord, that Jesus would be glorified in all that we do and say. It's in his name we pray. Amen.